Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm so thrilled to have you with me here today. Before we get started, I'd like to ask you to remember to like the video and subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you can be notified of new uploads, and to comment under this video and to share this video. I'd also like to extend a huge thank you to the people who've supported this channel on Patreon. Their names are going to be displayed at the end of the video. And if you would like to support this channel on Patreon, there will be a link in the description. No hard feelings if you can't, I get it, money's tight. But there will be hard feelings if you don't follow me on Instagram, because that's free. I've also linked my email in the description below in case you need to get in touch with me for any reason. Now, if you live in the United States, odds are you've at least at some point heard people mentioning the Boston Brahmins before. The term is used with a relative frequency to describe the wealthy and elite of Boston and of New England generally, and even to a certain extent of the entire United States. I used it myself in my capstone paper, in which I said, quote, "Global warming will impact the poor of, say, Boston differently than it would impact the Brahmins of Beacon Hill." Boston Brahmins tend to live on Beacon Hill. But where did this term come from, and what does it actually mean? And who were the original Boston Brahmins? And are there any of them still around? Well, if those are questions that you've been asking, you're in the right place, because I'm about to answer them. Before we delve into looking at what the Boston Brahmins are, we should figure out what a Brahmin of the non-Boston variety is. To tell you a little bit more about this, I have invited my boyfriend onto the channel. Being a Brahmin himself, he is infinitely more qualified to speak on the subject than I. Sushruta, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello everyone, my name is Sushruta and I'm Adelaide's boyfriend, and she asked me to explain who the Brahmins are in Indian culture and maybe a little more broadly the role in the caste system and what exactly that is. So this is kind of a really rough overview, but Brahmins are a classification or a category within the classification system that is the caste or Varna system as it is known in India. And the system dates back to the Vedic period and the ancient Vedic texts which underlie the religion of Hinduism. And there are roughly 4 categories in the caste system. Of course, there are thousands of different castes and subcastes, but to simplify, there are the Brahmins, which consist of kind of the knowledgeable categories of occupations like priests, spiritual teachers, gurus, people occupied in the pursuit of knowledge. Then there are the Kshatriyas, which are the warrior class and ruler class. So people like kings, people who go out and do the fighting, that kind of occupation. And there are the Vaishyas, which consists of the merchants, tradesmen, skilled artisans, those kinds of trades. And then the Shudras, which were laborers traditionally. And then outside of this are tribal people as well as Dalits, which were also known as untouchables. Now this system was entrenched in Hinduism and still is today in many parts, but it was codified into law only during the colonial period, in which the British essentially performed a census to enumerate the castes and then also incorporated that into law to kind of as a project to figure out which castes could have which occupations. And of course this created lots of discrimination that we see even today, and the vestiges of that the government is trying to remediate with reservations or affirmative action to essentially give positions of power and also opportunities to people from the lower castes as well as those from the higher ones. The Brahmins specifically, as I mentioned, they were traditionally people you would see in temples, administering prayers or, preaching, giving sermons, as you might think of it, or performing pujas, or being like spiritual teachers, like gurus, or teaching, the greater public and the higher caste essentially. Instructing them on the ways of the Vedas or language, Sanskrit, things like that.
Do you want to tell us what a puja is?
Mm-hmm. Puja is kind of like a ritual ceremony, a prayer. Often consists of some sort of recital of texts from the Vedas or otherwise. Vedas are the underlying texts of Hinduism as we know it today. And also sometimes consists of some sort of ritual sacrifice. It's not like human or animal, but offerings to usually like a fire or some sort of deity, which is the deity of interest for that puja.
Oftentimes it's a sacrifice of ghee, isn't it?
Ghee, or different food items like rice or lentils, things like that.
All right. Thank you. He asked me to add that the caste system is hereditary, so you're born into a caste. So while he was born a Brahmin, he does not identify as one because he doesn't approve of the caste system. So now that we know what a Brahmin is, how on earth did the term come to be applied to the Boston elites, the so-called American gentry? Well, the term was first coined by writer Oliver Wendell Holmes, who, incidentally, was a Boston Brahmin himself. Holmes wrote a serialized story called The Professor's Story for the Atlantic Monthly. In 1860, Chapter 1 of Volume 5, Issue 27 was published, which was entitled The Brahmin Caste of New England. Holmes's description of the Brahmins of New England is as follows, quote, "There is, however, in New England an aristocracy, if you will choose to call it so, which has a greater character of permanence. It has grown to be a caste, not in any odious sense, but by the repetition of the same influences generation after generation, it has acquired a distinct organization and physiognomy." He also describes the Boston Brahmins as being harmless, inoffensive, untitled aristocracy. The serialized story was turned into the novel Elsie Venner, which was published in 1861. To quote from CelebrateBoston.com, "The object of Elsie Venner was an attempt to illustrate the doctrine of inherited moral responsibility for other people's misbehavior. In broad terms, this was an intentional contradiction of certain Calvinist beliefs, such as predestination." CelebrateBoston.com also says, quote, "An unintended consequence of describing a New England caste of strict progeny, educational, religious, and business practices was to make the Brahmin families appear quite elitist." Which, I mean, yeah, they do. At first glance, it may appear that Holmes perhaps compared the New England elites to the wrong caste. As you have just heard, the Brahmins were religious, they were the priestly caste. So it may seem more apt to compare the elites of Boston to the ruling Kshatriyas or the merchant Vishyas. However, on closer inspection, the sobriquet of Brahmin actually does make sense. Although the Boston Brahmins tended, and still tend, not to go into the priesthood, Holmes, to quote from Slate, used the term to refer to families who produced generation after generation of scholars at institutions like Harvard. He contrasted this, quote, race of scholars whose aptitude for learning was congenital and hereditary, to what he called the common country boy, whose race had been bred to bodily labor. Although he did believe that somebody could raise himself up from being a common country boy through the virtues of education. But this focus on education, learnedness, and heredity does make the comparison to the learned Brahmin caste of India much more apt. The Boston Brahmin families are oftentimes associated with the great families of the Gilded Age. I'll link a playlist there. The Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, Carnegies, etc. But there's not actually a ton of overlap. The Great Gilded Age families really kind of rose to prominence in the second half of the 19th century, whereas the Boston Brahmins have been in charge since before the Revolution. Many of them came over in the early 1600s and honestly probably would have seen themselves as being above the new money robber barons. And a quick side note, just because a family is old does not mean that it's part of the Boston Brahmins. My family has also been in America since the early 1600s. We don't have a Beacon Hill address or anything like that. For a family to be part of the Boston Brahmins, it's got to be old, powerful, and rich. My family checks only one of those boxes. Many of the Boston Brahmin families intermarried with each other, and many of their names are still very well known today. Names like Adams, Boylston, Cabot, Coffin, Coolidge, Crowninshield, Delano, Emerson, Endicott, Forbes, Gardner, Gillette, Hallowell, Healy Dahl, Holmes, Lowell, Palfrey, Peabody, Rice, Saltonstall, Sargent, Shaw, Sturgis, Thorndike, and Wigglesworth are some, but not all, of the most well-known Boston Brahmin families. And I'm sure that you recognized at least some of those names. I'm not going to go over the histories of each of these families because that would take a long time. If you're interested, I could do deep dives in different videos, kind of akin to my robber baron videos. I'm kind of running out of robber barons, so that might be fun. So let me know if you're interested in that. But I will tell you about some of the more notable Boston Brahmins. The phrase Boston Brahmin is starting to lose its meaning in my head. Founding Father Samuel Adams, President John Adams, President John Quincy Adams, and Ivers Whitney Adams, founder of the Boston Red Sox, all came from the Adams family. That's Adams with one D, not the da-da-da-da. From the Appleton family came Frances Appleton, who was the wife of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and Jane Means Appleton Pierce, who was First Lady of the United States from 1853 to 1857. From the Bradley family came Nathaniel and Josiah Bradley, who both took part in the Boston Tea Party. The Coolidge family gave us President Calvin Coolidge. The Cooper family gave us First Lady Priscilla Cooper Tyler. Frank Crowningshield was the creator of Vanity Fair. From the Delano family came President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. Ralph Waldo Emerson came from the Emerson family. Isabella Stewart Gardner married into the Gardner family. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the man who coined the term Boston Brahmin, and his son, the Supreme Court Justice, Oliver Wendell Holmes, very creative name, I know, both came from the Holmes family. From the Lowell family came Francis Cabot Lowell, who, notice that name Cabot, which is another Brahmin family. Francis Cabot Lowell, who is credited with starting the Industrial Revolution in the United States, so that's no small accomplishment, for better or for worse. From the Payne family came founding father and signature of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Treat Payne. Bill Gates is related to the Phillips family. John Singer Sargent, who is a very well-known painter, was a member of the illustrious Sargent family. The original cottagecore influencer herself, Tasha Tudor, hailed from the Tudor family. And from the Whitney family came Eli Whitney, inventor of the cotton gin. This is far from an exhaustive list of the influential Boston Brahmins. For those of you who are keeping track at home, this list does include 4 United States presidents, also a lot of the founding fathers of the United States and revolutionary soldiers were Boston Brahmin families. These families shaped America far more than any of the robber barons of the Gilded Age ever could. Like it or not, these few powerful families are the reason that America exists in the way it does today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you here next time. Bye-bye. Well, the term was first coined. Well, the term was first coined by Oliver Wendell Holmes.